I believe that the agenda summary indicated about an hour. I remember.
So the presentation's an hour?
No, it would be the entire.
How long is the present? Well, the reason I ask is we're already 20 minutes into the timeline. I've got a commitment this evening for which I'm going to need to leave here shortly. My hope was to get as much of this as I can, because I read the report. It's great information. I wanted to see as much of the presentation as possible. So with that in mind, I'll sit as long as I can sit, but I'm going to be pushing it to make my commitment. Unfortunately, we spent another hour on Gorsh again, and then it's eaten into everything else. So.
Understood. We will do what we can to move it through. I believe the presentation is so about 15 minutes or so. Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Diana Hershey. Today we're here to review the implementation of Housing Element Action Item 2.7. Item 2.7 requires the county to participate in a survey to analyze the housing needs of all farm workers in the county, including migrant, seasonal, and permanent farm worker households. The importance of the data that would be gathered by this survey are documentations of areas for future farm worker housing, proper location of housing projects, degree of grower support for housing, documentation of choices being made by farm worker families in relationship to rent versus other items of necessity. It also will document locations, future locations for a possible van pool, and we received funding from the Caltrans Agricultural Workers Transportation Program in the spring of '07 for part of the survey. We received about $45,500 around that for this program to fund the survey. So the information that they required us to do is origin, destination, information about where farm workers are living, where they're working, and with the eye to trying to project routes for a van pool that could then perhaps be funded by their program. The board decided to contract with California Institute of Rural Studies last spring to do the farm worker survey, and it's because of the Caltrans funding, it is also a transportation and housing needs assessment. So Executive Director Ron Strolick from CIRS is here to discuss the survey, the methodology, the administration, and the findings. And after that, then planning team member Patrick Ford will go over the origin, destination, and proposed routes. So that's what we're... Where's the file? Excuse me.
Sure.
This is Ron Strolick, the director.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Ron Strolick, Executive Director of the California Institute for Rural Studies. For those of you not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit applied research institute based in Davis, and our mission is to conduct research that promotes rural California that's socially just, ecologically balanced, and economically viable. I'm here today to present the findings from the survey that's been discussed, and I'll try and be quick because I know we have some time constraints. Do I just do that for me, Patrick? Or? Okay. So as you can see, the objectives of the assessment, as Diane also mentioned, were to identify the numbers of farm workers living and working in Mendocino County, specifically by length of employment. That's an important issue when you're working with farm workers. To assess housing conditions among farm workers in Mendocino County, and to assess transportation patterns and potential demand for farm worker van pool in Mendocino County. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about methods. We used a range of different methods to gather the information that's presented in the survey. We conducted an employer survey. A randomly selected sample of 100 employers were contacted via telephone. It was a stratified random sample, and the data that were collected were numbers of farm workers employed, length of employment, whether employers provided housing and or transportation, and employer recommendations for improving farm worker housing and transportation. Next. The other method that we used was a farm worker survey. We conducted face-to-face surveys with 205 farm workers working in Mendocino County during the period August through October of this year. The interviews were conducted in Spanish in collaboration with Nuestra Casa, which is a CBO based in UK. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Santiago and thank him again for his help on this. And the data collected from the survey were place of residence, housing conditions, including cost, crowding, accompaniment status, income and employment, origin destination data, transportation options and costs, and farm worker recommendations for improving farm worker housing and transportation. I would like to mention briefly that we were forced to deviate from our original methodology for the farm worker survey, which was based on a stratified random sample. We were able to collect about 108, if I'm not mistaken, interviews using that sample. And at that point, we were able to visit all the employers that agreed to participate in the survey. We had a fairly high refusal rate, unfortunately. And then at that point, we resorted to another sampling methodology called a convenience sample. So there are some discrepancies in the data based on that, and that's something that you should be aware of. We also conducted key informant interviews, telephone interviews with 19 individuals familiar with housing and transportation needs of farm workers in Mendocino County. Those were recommended by the task force that was assembled to oversee this assessment. And we also gathered origin destination data for farm workers that Patrick will be presenting in a little bit. And as I mentioned, the assessment was overseen by a task force comprised of individuals representing agriculture, farm workers, public, private, and nonprofit sectors. So I'd like to briefly touch on some of the key findings. In terms of numbers of farm workers, roughly we found 4,163 farm workers in 2006. All the data referred to the previous full year of employment. For those employed 7 months or more, 34%, approximately a third of the farm workers are what we would call long-term residents of the county. 3 to 6 months, about 16%, and then what we're calling seasonal or temporary were employed for less than 3 months were about 50%. So about half of the workforce is seasonal. Again, I should mention that the data were only collected during the harvest period, so we can't really talk about year-round patterns. Unfortunately, because of the timing of the grant and the grant deadline, we were not able to conduct year-round sampling as we had hoped to do. So this is only reflective of that period of time. In terms of permanent place of residence, we were surprised to see the high number of farm workers that actually call Mendocino County their permanent place of residence. That was 90%. And then the remainder were either from adjacent counties, non-adjacent counties, or follow the crop seasonal migrants. Accompaniment status is very important. People often think of farm workers typically as unaccompanied single men that are here by themselves. What we found actually was that about a third of the farm workers in our sample are accompanied by either a spouse and or children. This has important implications for the type of housing that needs to be provided. A fourth of the households included children under the age of 18 with a mean of 2.4 kids, and actually almost half of the households with children had 3 or more kids. We also looked at children's living arrangements. This is something that's very important because farm workers, to save costs because of crowding and other issues, often need to share accommodations with both related and unrelated adults. And what we found that 68% of farm worker children live in nuclear type situations with a parent and kids only. And then the other approximately third live with parents and related adults or parents and unrelated adults. This has potentially important implications in terms of children's health and well-being. There are anecdotally high levels of abuse reported when children are living in situations with